Hello and welcome to the Outcomes Over Hours show. I'm Tina Patterson and I'm really excited with the guest that we have today, Dr. Ben Hamer. And the reason for this is we were just chatting before we started recording, and there are so many nuggets that Ben has that I'm sure that he'll be sharing here about the future of work. And this is really an area where he is an expert. He actually is in charge of the future of work practice at PWC Australia, and he's the one who provides thought leadership to loads of firms in this area. So as you can imagine, we do have a lot in common in talking about outcomes over hours. But Ben also has a really impressive CV. So I'll just share with you a couple of the things for Ben. So he's an adjunct professor at the Edith Cowan University for their Centre of Work and Wellbeing. Also, he was appointed to the board of the Australian Human Resources Institute, and he was the youngest ever non-executive director there. So really, really impressive. He also has worked for the World Economic Forum, and he also has been a visiting scholar at Yale. So Ben, welcome to the Outcomes Over Hours show.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, as mentioned, you are one of the experts, the leading experts when it comes to the future of work. And so what I'd love to hear is your views of what you're seeing right now, as well as what might be the 2 or 3 trends that you're seeing if you look at the next decade of where the workplace might be going.
Yeah, I think we're at this inflection point at the moment where I think a lot of what's starting to happen and what's dominating the kind of future of work conversation has some real short-term implications, but then also are going to transform work over the next decade. So I think some of the themes are really common, whether or not we're talking about the now of work or the future of work. So the first one that comes to mind for me is around the office. So when we're thinking about the role of the office and how that's changed and people coming into the office and working from home, what we're seeing is that the old office is dead. And so this whole notion of people saying, I go to work and work is the office, no longer exists. The whole notion of 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office, for most working Australians who go to work in an office, which, let's be honest, isn't the majority of the population, but a fair chunk, that whole notion of the traditional work week is gone as well. So what we're seeing is that people want to work around half their week in the office, half their week at home, and I expect that to sort of play out into the future. But what was really interesting, some data came from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, because they measured this, and they found that as people started to come back into the office after lockdown lifted, productivity actually dropped. And so why I find that interesting is a lot of CEOs and executives out there have been saying you need to come back into the office because you're more productive. And that's fundamentally wrong. And it goes to the heart of this whole concept of outcomes over hours. So what we found and what sort of the US Bureau found was that people are more productive working from home because productivity in its traditional sense is output over time. And so how much do you actually just churn through? So the home is where we're most productive. The office has fundamentally changed now because it's about collaboration, connection, networking, building relationships, building psychological safety. And so that whole notion of why people come into the office, they're not coming in to simply open up their laptop and get through a whole heap of administrative tasks. They're coming in for a very different reason. So the design of offices will change. The way that we plan and design our work weeks around that as well need to change. So we choose the best work environment for the work that needs to be done. And the office, I would actually argue, is more important than ever, but it just has a very different use or purpose around that. And so that's going to really change and evolve over time, both in terms of ways of working, but also the physical design of offices. It'll be much more collaboration spaces. I think about it as like an airline lounge into the future. So they'll need to earn the commute of their people. A lot of people or organizations will do that by providing food and coffee and everything like that. But lots of sort of lounges where people can just sit down and have coffee and connect and chat, desks where they can plug in and play, access to a printer, but a very sort of different intent behind the design to what we see in current buildings. So I kind of think about that as one of the major disruptors at the moment. Another one that I think is getting a lot of traction is this notion of the 4-day work week. And that's another interesting one because, look, from an industrial perspective, it's not going to happen anytime soon in the sense that we're not going to see the new normal legislatively be 4 days a week in Australia. But what we are seeing is this real movement that's a movement that's gone from sort of what I would call executive entertainment, where it's just a really interesting conversation, to executives and employees really starting to go, hang on, what's the value of this and can we make this work? And so, a lot of your viewers would have seen the trials of the 4-day work week in the UK and overseas, one happening in Australia. But what really I'm interested in is that we're seeing lots of individual organizations on their own accord take it up. So, some multinational organizations, small businesses, startups, and I think that's what we're going to see sort of playing out over the next decade or so, is not system-wide change, but where individual organizations offer 4-day work weeks and embed 4-day work weeks as part of their value proposition and how they fundamentally redesign work. So I think that will become more popular, but at a case-by-case basis rather than system-wide. And the third thing for me is, and I don't think I can kind of talk about the future of work for you without talking about generative AI and ChatGPT. I think that, that really is going to be the number one thing that transforms work over the next decade. And the way that I think about it, if I kind of stick to a ways of working perspective for you, is ChatGPT, or there will be more sophisticated versions than ChatGPT that enter the market. So generative AI, it's basically everyone's universal intern. We all have an intern now at our disposal. It's ChatGPT. It gives us the ability to do things more efficiently, more productively, if we know how to use it and to use it for the right reasons. The one thing that I would, that we really need to work through, and where I would err on the side of caution, is, I mean, you've probably worked with clients where you help them try and be more productive and to, work smarter, not harder. But as humans, when we have time, we tend to fill it. And at work, we tend to fill it on stuff that doesn't really add value. And so it's really important that as we do look to redesign work and we leverage this kind of technology to be better and more efficient at our jobs, we don't just start adding fluff and mess on top of it and pad out the workday, that we actually really fundamentally rethink, okay, what do we do with this time or capacity?
Oh, I love that, Ben. Oh, there's so many good things here to unpack. And I think if we start with that last one there, as you're talking about generative AI and ChatGPT, it reminds me back to, when was it? About 20 years ago, when I headed up contact centers, and we're just talking about digitization. And we were just talking about, for a contact center, what type of calls could maybe someone do via a website, which at the time was like out there thinking. And so the number of calls coming into the contact centers ended up dropping a lot, as we ended up putting a lot more to self-service online. But what I found really interesting, and I'm interested in your thoughts on, is then how we had to upskill our employees, because the low-hanging fruit of the really easy calls were then gone. How to change an address went from someone calling in and a contact center person knowing how to do that to happening on the website. So what ended up happening was trickier questions ended up coming in and problems to solve. And we worked out that we actually had to upskill our people in problem solving, critical thinking, because a lot of the easier type of work was taken out. Do you see something similar if you think about this evolution? I love your idea of ChatGPT being like the intern, of they take the easier stuff and therefore we're left with the harder things and we need to upskill more. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, the number one skill that I think is sort of has come out of nowhere with the rise of ChatGPT is the art of asking good questions, because that's kind of, when you talk about getting value out of the likes of ChatGPT, it can be pretty average or it can be super powerful, and it's based on asking the right questions. And so I think that's sort of this fundamental skill that's emerging. But I think, going to your broader point, it's kind of bringing to the fore and bringing to reality what a lot of sort of the leading thinkers in this space, like the World Economic Forum, who publish on the skills of the future, and those sorts of institutions, they've always been saying that we need to focus on building human skills. And a lot of people have gone, well, hang on, if it's all about automation and tech, then why aren't we talking about building digital skills? But it's because of exactly that point. As more gets automated, a lot of that then means that the value of the human experience becomes greater. It means that people's roles will be transformed so that they won't need to do some of those the low-hanging fruit kind of tasks, the role will be redesigned to focus on the human value that the individual brings and the skills that make us uniquely human. And so that goes to your point around teamwork, problem solving, collaboration, critical thinking, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think we're going to see a really big focus around how we go about upskilling in regard to those human skills. And it's going to really be a collaborative effort between government, between organizations and individuals. It doesn't sit, sort of the responsibility doesn't sit with one particular individual within all of that. But that's then going to permeate and go right down into the education system and how we're preparing people for the future of work as well.
Yeah, beautiful. And I love your comment in there also about as people's time frees up, it's not about shoving more stuff in. And I think that's a brilliant point. Going back to your second point around the 4-day work week. So one thing, I actually have done a 4-day work week for many, many years, even in senior roles in corporate. I was lucky enough to have bosses who we had the trust there to say, as long as I can commit to the full-time outcomes, can I be out of the office on Fridays? And we had really clear rules around it. It was literally the CEO can't meet on any other day. And my thinking was, okay, for the CEO, I'll come in on a Friday. Or there's a senior leaders event, everyone else is coming. Once again, thinking, okay, I should absolutely flex here. But I had really, really clear boundaries. But one of the things, though, that I think enabled me to do that was that I'd focus for a long time on how do you work smarter? How do you have it that you can actually really ramp up those outcomes over those hours? And I hear a lot of people say, I love the idea of a 4-day week. I'm really worried that it's just I end up doing 16-hour days on my 4 days and it's actually the work doesn't stop. What are your views on that when you think about the future of work and the 4-day week and how corporations can support their people to be able to actually feel okay to do a 4-day week if that is the path they go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, to be honest, easier to do it if it was a company-wide initiative rather than on an individual case-by-case basis, because company-wide, you're not needing to justify anything. It's, you know, there's the broader system that's adapting to flex to it. So I think that's sort of an easier case study to go off. For an individual, though, you know, it's also the fact that, I mean, the concern is not just doing the 16-hour days on the 4 days, but that you're continually contacted on your day off, that you don't end up actually having the day off in. So then you go, well, why am I getting, you know, why am I doing a 4-day work week? And really, I'm just doing 5 and silly hours. So yeah, it's a really hard one, but I think you hit the nail on the head right from the start, which is that it's all about boundaries. It's about being really clear around, you know, your can-dos and can-nots. I think, you know, I have some colleagues who have done it with children, and I think that what's been the sort of the turning point for them is that, you know, if they have to pick their child up from school at 3:30, as an example, they have to pick their child up from school at 3:30. It's not a, oh, yeah, I'll just pick them up at 4:30 and I'll take that meeting, that's fine. And I think that that's been a really great and clear way for people having, you know, conviction behind boundaries. And I think that's what it comes down to is you need to not just have the arrangement in place, there has to be the sort of the conviction from yourself, and then also making sure that you're in an environment that has that level of psychological safety where you can be vulnerable, where you can, you know, where you can challenge, where you can push back and not feel like there'll be that level of reprimand around it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who has lived the 3:30 pickup and you cannot be late, I fully get that. And I think for businesses and organisations, it's really important also that context that, yes, that's really clear for working parents, but it doesn't matter whether you're a parent or not and what your reasons are. So whether it is to play badminton or you want to go for a surf, that is just as legitimate as someone who is picking up a child or whatever it might be. So I love the conversations where it's also about whatever's important to you outside of work. That's up to you. It's not that one.
Yeah. So for me, like, so I play competitive netball. So that means
beautiful.
Certain days I have to be at training at 5 p.m, which means I need to get off the clock at 4 p.m. so I can get ready and I can drive out. And it's just about having those conversations up front, setting the expectation. and the assurance that you will get the work done. It just means that it's not going to be done in a traditional 9-to-5 day. But I'm lucky that I've always had the support of managers that have sort of enabled me to do that as well.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So you spoke about managers just then, and I think the role of the leader is a really interesting one as we think about this future of work. So for my book, Effective Remote Teams, I interviewed corporate executives, and I just asked them one question, which I'm going to ask you now. But the question that I asked them was, what are the 2 to 3 leadership traits that you believe corporate leaders need to be able to lead effectively in our new normal where we're not all together in the office full time? So same question to you. What do you see for leaders are their key skills that they really need to amplify or focus on?
Yeah, so I think for me, sort of, and I'll get to the skills, but fundamentally underpinning it all is, I think, a mindset shift that needs to happen. A lot of the sort of the world of work that a lot of people were promoted into those positions of leadership in is no longer the world of work that we exist in today, particularly when we're thinking about sort of hybrid and the move to virtual working as well. So, underpinning all of that is that, there was this notion when sort of we moved into lockdown and working from home became the norm, noting that people like yourself were already doing this sort of hybrid working arrangement for years, but that's where it really became the norm, was through COVID. And what we did was we threw everything that happened face-to-face online and expected it to work the same. So all of a sudden you would have 10 people on a virtual call and you called it a virtual workshop. That's just 10 people on a call. It's not a virtual workshop. And so that's where we need to go, well, what does a virtual workshop look like? Or when you're thinking about allocating tasks, you can't just turn around to one of your sort of team members and say, hey, Tina, can you do this? You need to think really deliberately around that, and also be cognizant of, hey, if I can't see them working every day, I might not have a handle of exactly everything that they're working on. So I need to be conscious of who I'm allocating tasks to, and that I'm not, driving burnout, I'm looking after well-being, etc. So there's that sort of stuff that we need to think about. Also things like when it comes to sort of, genuinely caring about their people as well. I think one of the things that I saw through lockdowns was managers and leaders actually cared about their people. And it sounds really silly to say, it even sounds a little bit patronizing, but like the distinction for me was, when we moved into lockdown and COVID was a real thing, right? And it was like, well, absolutely in the thick of it, it wasn't, hey, how are you? Good, thanks, Ben. How are you? Yeah, good, thanks. Anyway, the meeting, it was, I would say, hey, Tina, how are you? And you would be like, yeah, I'm okay, like doing all right. And then I would actually ask follow-up questions because I would actually care and give a crap about how you felt and what you had to say. And to me, that's one of the things that we've lost as soon as we went back into the office, with the niceties of social interactions and social norms kicked back in. And so I think it's kind of, a roundabout way of answering your question. I think that it's that mindset to rethink ways of working, which means, embracing disruption, around being agile and open-minded. It's around really caring about your people and bringing it back to that human-centered leadership. I think is, again, as more and more technology comes into the world of work, that human centricity is really important. And just the other thing that I would say, which is more so around middle managers than senior executives, I've noticed, is that particularly in Australia, but it's even globally, but particularly in Australia, over the last 12 to 18 months, we've had this really tight labour market. And particularly with the impacts of, border closures and what that did to skilled migration, et cetera, it was really bloody hard to recruit. And so what I've noticed is a lot of people have been promoted far earlier than they should have been into these middle management roles, because there was simply no one else around, because they were the best of the people that applied, even if they weren't actually ready for the job, and they got put into that role. And that's not a criticism of that individual, but it's to say that organizations really need to invest in the absolute bare basics of middle management. So how to have difficult conversations, how to delegate properly, how to manage workload, that sort of stuff is becoming more and more important off the back of the last 12 to 18 months. And so, yes, it's around investing in some of those leadership traits, but it's also just getting back to basics with some cohorts as well.
Oh, it's such a great insight. And to think, yes, it's not just your senior level, and particularly how you're going of investing in building the people who might be new to roles as well. Fantastic. So we had a conversation before we started recording, and I'd love to pick it up again around what you're seeing though with different types of employees and their expectations. So we're talking about Gen Z, millennials, etc., and what they expect from leaders that is probably a bit different than those of us who have been around the block a few times. Can you just share what your insights are and what you're seeing that you would want leaders to know as they're thinking about how they lead their teams?
Yeah, so, it's always been a popular topic, which is generations in the workforce, and particularly because when you go from, we still have 5 generations, very soon going to 4 generations in the workforce, but vast differences between baby boomer and Generation Z expectations. And particularly when it comes to Gen Z, I think it's probably, I'm noticing more of that distinction than sort of when you look back in history and you look at, well, what was different between, what workers want from this to this to this to this. Gen Z seem to be sort of driving quite a lot of shift and change in that space. And so a couple of things. Look, pay is really, really important to Generation Z, particularly with cost of living pressures. A lot of them want to get out of living from home with their family, and that is also where they work. And so, pay is still super important. But they're really shifting the dial around purpose, wanting purpose-driven organizations and organizations that align with their values. We're seeing and noting that I think the example you and I were talking about prior to this call as it relates to flexibility is that Gen Z are absolutely pushing for work-life balance and flexibility. They value work-life balance more than any other generation. But also, there was a study that came out recently from Officeworks and that looked at the current state of flexible working. And what it found was that of all job seekers in Australia, 59% of Gen Z job seekers turn down a role in an organisation because of insufficient flexible working policies and practices, which was far more than any other generation. Yeah. So it changes this sort of expectation of some leaders that I think there's this outdated view that flexible working is for working mothers. And that's absolutely not the case. Yeah. Flexible working, as you said, permeates across all individuals with all circumstances. And it's early career people under the age of 26 entering the workforce, sometimes going to their very first job, who are calling out organisations who don't have sufficient flexible working practices and not working for them.
Yeah, amazing. And do you have, I'm going to shift it up completely. Do you have a morning routine? And if so, what is it?
My gosh, okay, I can't stress this enough. I'm not a morning person. So do I have a morning routine? It's generally trying to get out of bed. But once I do get out of bed, I go and get a coffee. Always first thing is go and get a coffee. And that gets me out of the house as well. I've tried to do the whole buy a coffee machine at home, and I think I needed the getting out of the house thing. Pardon me. So go and get a coffee, and I listened to a podcast on the way to get coffee. So it's called The Squiz, which is 10 minutes of getting the news headlines and things that sort of you want to get across, and saves me having to read a newspaper. So yeah, listen to that podcast, get across the news, get a coffee, and then I tend to try and limit morning meetings as much as possible because that's not my productive time. Yep. So I then just often get into emails and do all sort of my administrative stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. It's interesting. I interviewed Wendy Mack recently, the Chief Marketing Officer at Link, and she said, I'm a night owl. And I think that's a really interesting point also in terms of breaking down the stereotypes to say we're not all at our most productive at the same times, and that's okay. And think about when you do have the energy is really important, and building that in so it's not the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, because we know that's not for everyone their times. Fantastic. And then what is the best, most practical advice you've been given about how to work smarter?
So the best bit is exactly what you just said, around kind of going where your energy is, and that 9 to 5 sort of doesn't fit everyone. Because I think for me, I found very early on that sort of my most productive hours are probably around 6 to 9 p.m. at night. Yep. And I'm fortunate that I don't, when I say fortunate, I don't currently have kids, which fortunately means I can actually use that time at night to do work. So what that also means is then not feeling like I need to log on at 8 or 9 a.m. because I am going to do sort of a different sort of hourly pattern, and I communicate that, I set up those boundaries, and that's okay. So kind of maximizing your energy and not forcing yourself into situations or work patterns and structures that kind of go against that. So yeah, that's when I really try and maximize sort of, particularly when I have like to get into flow. And that's the other thing as well around flow time. So what I found is that I often, and I got to a point where my diary was like 30-minute meeting, 30 minutes to do work, 30-minute meeting, 30 minutes to do work. And by the time you decompress from the meeting, get your headspace to do the work, and then have to prepare for the next meeting, I actually got nothing done and I was not productive. And so what I've done is I've blocked out, sometimes it's a whole day, sometimes it's a morning, sometimes it's just an hour here and there, but what I call flow time. So I can actually get in the flow of needing to do work and deep thinking. And sometimes I don't use it, and then it's great because I got a spare hour where I can kind of do whatever. But really protecting that kind of time. And there are some organizations that have actually organization-wide, for example, a Monday morning is flow time. So no meetings in the organization on a Monday morning. So that I think is really important. They're probably like the two big ones for me. I think the only other thing that I would sort of that I really sort of stick to is when it comes to writing. I write quite a lot in my job, and I learned very quickly that there's no such thing as a perfect first draft. And I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I would be so slow writing a first draft because I was so careful about each word that I would write. And now I just write stream of conscious. I just get something on a page because I find that it's so much easier to edit and work with something that exists than to create something from scratch. And 100%. Just that mentality, has shifted things significantly. And I'm so much faster at needing to just pump stuff out now.
Oh, I love that. And I do the same with clients when we're thinking and we're dreaming up and co-designing what their workshops will look like. I'll scribble stuff and I say, it's much better we got something on paper. We can throw rocks at it now than a clean sheet of paper and then starting from scratch. I'm so
with totally.
Fantastic. Now I've got some rapid fire questions to finish up. Are you game for it?
Let's do it.
Okay. What is the best purchase you've made over the last few years that cost less than $100?
So I do a lot of Instagram purchasing, but if I think about the best thing, I would say it's a NutriBullet. So, I mean, sometimes they're over $100, but depends what you get. You can get them for under 100, but particularly if you've only got like 5 minutes between meetings and everything, you can make a smoothie, you can whack all your protein powder and chia seeds and vegetables. And so big fan of a NutriBullet.
Yep, I used mine this morning. And what is the book that you have either recommended the most or given the most? And I'd also love for you to share, given you are an author. Maybe we start with, can you share the name of your book first of all, and then we'll ask what one that you've recommended the most. So
that probably is the one that like I've gifted the most, only because I've got so many copies sitting there. So my book's called The Kick-Ass Career: How to Succeed in the Future of Work, which is sort of everything from a high school student through to a CEO around what are all the future of work trends, but what does it mean for you personally in your job? In terms of the book that I've gifted the most, I have in my cupboard a stack of, it's a coffee table book from Humans of New York. I don't know if you know the Facebook page, but it captures a lot of the photographs and stories. And so I have it there if like I ever need to give a gift to someone and I don't have time to go to the shops, or you just think of it before you go to their house, I just get one of those, and that's the go-to.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I love Humans of New York. Fantastic. What's the most fearless thing you've done over recent years?
So like I have a fine line between fearless and stupid. So I'm going to say stupid. And for me, it is, we renovated a house for 3 years. We then sold it as soon as we finished the renovation. We then bought a house that required a renovation. And I hate renovating, and I have a severe dust allergy. So yeah, I wouldn't say fearless, I'd say stupid.
Amazing though. And finally, what does outcomes over hours mean to you?
I think for me, it's a new metric by which we need to value and measure work in the new world of work. I think going to the conversation we had earlier around productivity, which is output over time, I think in a knowledge economy, that's completely pointless. It might be useful in a factory and is still, and that's still very much a part of work these days. But as we move towards office jobs and knowledge work, I think the outcomes over hours is really the mentality and the measure by which we need to try and change and shift and move towards that new way of working.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ben Hamer, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on my show.
Thank you.